Susan was raised with empathy, generosity, and kindness. She assisted her mother with housework, took care of their elderly neighbor when her health deteriorated, and shared candy with other kids in the yard and at class. Girls from very modest backgrounds were frequently among Susan's pals because she chose them based on their hearts rather than their social standing. Susan never spared anything for her pals, thus these girls frequently ended up with her greatest toys. Susan frequently said that her mother was her best friend and that she could confide in her about anything. The youngster was also adamant that her mother had never concealed anything from her. They enjoyed going to the candy store together on the weekends, buying tea, and then having a sweet tea party while talking about everything. Susan believed that helping others was her calling. For this reason, she chose to enroll in one of the most prominent college's psychology departments following graduation. From her first days at university, Susan enjoyed learning. The fresh student enjoyed listening to lectures and quickly picked up new information. She enjoyed going to cafes with her friends, watching movies, and going on walks in the evenings. One such evening, she and her best friend Bridget were sipping tea in a modest, comfortable setting. "Oh, Susan, I'm a little envious of you." "Don't be insulted, please," complained Bridget. "Why?" Susan inquired with her acquaintance. "Your parents are like that. Your mother is a hospital chief physician, and your father is a professor, as well as mine." Bridget let out a sigh. "My dad is an artist who has failed. He drinks because he wants to find himself. Even at the age of 50, he continues to lament that he is an unacknowledged genius. In addition, my mom is a failed model. She never stops griping about how she squandered her best years on my father." Bridget let her another sigh and went on. "I'm also a loser. I'm bored when I'm in school and I don't enjoy my future career. Generally speaking, I failed to see the end of the tunnel." Susan felt self-conscious about spreading her happiness so readily without recognizing her friend's sadness. She really wanted to offer something supportive, but she couldn't think of anything to say. There was a pause, and then she hesitantly said, "Bridget, what about Elton? He is expected to be a decent man. Why don't you leave your parents and get married to him?" Her pals simply snorted in return. "As though I could compel him to wed me. Where can we go, anyway? We have nothing and nowhere to dwell. He is well aware of the fact that he is impoverished and an orphan. So he keeps saying that when he gets money, he would marry me. However, I get the feeling that it will never occur." With a sigh, Bridget turned to face Susan as though she were the cause. "You know what?" said Susan. "Stop being depressed. It won't help. Your parents are adults. Let them live as they want, and you and I will go shopping now. Let's buy something cute for ourselves." "It's too late," sighed Bridget. "And I don't have any money." "It's never too late," exclaimed Susan. "Come on, get up quickly, and let's go. Today is our day." They left the cafe and headed toward the shopping center, enjoying the cool evening air. All the shops were open, giving the girls plenty of choices. They tried on stylish boots at the shoe store, trendy dresses from a youth brand, autumn coats from the new collection, and everything looked great on their slender figures. One dress stood out from the rest, an elegant, daring coral dress that stole their hearts at first sight. The friends tried it on one by one, and it suited each of them perfectly, making them look like queens. Susan, who tried on the dress last, twirled in front of the mirror, admiring her slender waist. "Yes, it suits you," sighed Bridget. "But how much does it cost?" They looked at the price tag, and Bridget realized it was out of her budget. Besides, the dress was one of a kind, with two friends vying for it. "Yes, the dress is chic. We must take it," Susan merrily chanted, heading to the fitting room to take off the outfit. Bridget instantly lost all interest in further shopping, feeling sad that she could never have such a dress. After Susan applied her credit card to the payment terminal, the salesperson packed the magnificent dress into a large bag and persuasively asked them to visit their store again. Susan and Bridget left the store and found themselves on the street, illuminated by numerous evening lights. Okay, Susan, thanks for the coffee and the walk. It was fun. I'm feeling better now, but I'm going home. It's very late, Bridget said, heading toward the subway. How about a taxi? Susan suggested. No, I'm more comfortable this way, Bridget said, waving her hand toward the subway. Oh, you've forgotten something. Susan called out to Bridget, who turned around and saw her friend holding a huge box that she had just received from the store. What's this? Bridget asked, hesitating to accept the box. Oh, don't be silly. This is the dress. Did you think I bought it for myself? Susan laughed. Take it. It looks perfect on you. Wear it on a date, and Elton will definitely marry you. Bridget took the package and hugged her friend. Tears glistened in her eyes. Thank you, dear. Although I feel awkward accepting such a gift, I know you gave it from the heart, she said quietly. Susan smiled. Of course, from the heart. We're the best of friends. Well, goodbye, see you later. Goodbye, Susan. Thanks again for the gift. Bridget smiled as she descended into the subway, clutching the box with a coveted dress to her chest. She thought about how fortunate she was to have such a wonderful friend. She would never envy her again, only wish her happiness. Midweek, the girls called each other. Hey, Bridget, you won't believe it. My dad entrusted me with his old car. I'm going to learn to drive it. I have a license, but I rarely drive. And now I'm going to fix it, Susan reported cheerfully. What about driving to my parents' summer house with me? You know, like in the movies, the girlfriends drive and sing songs. It will be so much fun. Bridget hesitated. Listen, Susan, it's a good idea, but you really don't know how to drive properly. And I know. Some movies that have a sad ending. Susan laughed in response. Don't worry, girlfriend, I won't mix up the pedals. Everything will be fine. I'll come get you on Saturday at 8 a.m. Bridget agreed, and on Saturday, they set off for the summer house. Susan was actually driving pretty well, although she was overly cautious. Her inexperience was still evident. The girls laughed, sang songs, and occasionally winked at the guys in passing cars. The ride was beautiful until the car suddenly stalled. The bewildered friends got out of the car, took turns looking under the hood, but couldn't figure out what was wrong. Susan was terribly upset. This was her first big independent trip, and now tears were welling up in her eyes. Bridget, who was about to grumble, saw that her friend was about to burst into tears. Biting her tongue, she hugged her by the shoulders. Suddenly, a car stopped behind them. The girls turned around as a handsome young man looked out from behind the open door. What's wrong, beauties? Did your car break down? He asked cheerfully. None of your business, Bridget snapped sharply. Susan immediately pushed her in the side and turned to the young man. Oh, you know, we just stopped suddenly, and I don't know what to do. We don't want to call a tow truck. I understand, the guy smiled. If you don't mind, I'll take a look at your problem. We mind, Bridget suddenly answered angrily and once again received a push in the side from her friend. Have you lost your mind? He's offering to help and you're refusing, Susan whispered reproachfully. And did you see what kind of car he has? It's like a tin can. If he can't buy a decent car, he should go far away, Bridget grumbled through her teeth. No, I'm not going to stay here until evening, Susan replied. I don't care what kind of car he has. Susan turned to the car from which the stranger was peering and shouted, We would be truly grateful for your help. The guy smiled, closed the door, and headed toward their car. Looking under the hood, he clicked his tongue and said, Yeah, you wouldn't have been able to handle this without me. Bridget, who was scrutinizing his simple clothes, snorted contemptuously, while Susan replied amicably, Yes, we're counting on you. Then wait, now there will be magic. The young man smiled and began to tinker with the engine. A couple of minutes later, the engine started. Wow, you really are a wizard, Susan exclaimed with joy. No, I'm just a car mechanic, the guy laughed. By the way, my name is William. He extended his hand to the girl. And I'm Susan, she replied, shaking his hand. William also extended his hand to Bridget, but she pretended not to see it. I'm Bridget, she said through gritted teeth. Well, girls, I'm glad I could help. Have a safe trip. I recommend taking the car to the service. It needs to be checked. I have a couple of questions about it. Here's our business card. We recently opened a workshop, but we can do many things. You're welcome to come at any convenient time. We're from the capital, actually, Bridget snorted. I figured that from the license plates, the good-natured guy smiled. Our service is right there. What are you doing here then? Bridget asked. I visited my mother in my hometown, the guy simply replied. I see, Bridget said. Susan, let's go, she told her friend. Susan felt very awkward. She turned to William and thanked him. Thank you for your help. I'll definitely bring the car to you. Have a safe trip, William smiled back. Blushing, Susan got behind the wheel and scolded Bridget. Why are you so rude, Bridget? Oh, Susan, forget it. He's just a mechanic. He fixed the car and that's it. Let's go, I'm hungry. Bridget replied in a capricious tone. Susan sighed and stepped on the gas. It was great at the dacha, warm blankets, rattan chairs, tea drinking, and the fresh air. Her mother was relaxing while her father was busy with the barbecue. It was cozy and homely. The thought flashed through Susan's mind that these moments are remembered as the happiest in life. But despite the peaceful family idyll, a tiny worm was gnawing at her heart. She thought about William and how he must have felt seeing how disdainfully Bridget treated him. On Sunday, they returned home without incident. On Monday, right after school, Susan drove to the car service, which she had trouble finding, even with the help of the navigator. The tiny workshop, with a limited range of services, was crowded, so the girls had to wait. But when William finally came out, Susan shone. The guy was in dirty overalls, his hair was tousled, and his face looked tired. For a moment, he was taken aback, but he quickly regained his composure and smiled warmly. Susan, I didn't expect you to come so quickly, or at all, William said. The girl shrugged. I just didn't want to get stuck on the road again. That's smart, William praised. Let's see what the problem is. Will it take long? I'm rushing, Susan said, although she wasn't really in a rush. Well, it will take some time, William replied. But if you're in a hurry, let me drive you, and you can leave your car here. I'll call you about it later. Okay, let's do that, the girl agreed. William changed his clothes and even combed his hair, looking entirely different. He's handsome, Susan thought. She got into the car with him, and they were silent for the first few minutes of the ride. But soon, one timid word led to another, growing into a lively, interesting conversation. Even when they arrived at Susan's home, they couldn't stop talking, sitting in the car. The girl found out that William was 7 years older than her and had put in a huge effort to open the workshop with his friend. They were currently working at break-even, but they believed everything would soon be much better. She also learned about his hobbies. William loved equestrian sports and even had a couple of favorite horses in the stable that he dreamed of buying someday. The guy turned out to be not only a good storyteller, but also an attentive listener. He caught every word Susan said. They both felt they didn't want to part, but realizing that their conversation in the car had dragged on, they decided to say goodbye, exchanging phone numbers. That same evening, William called Susan, and upon hearing his soft, pleasant voice on the phone, the girl realized she had fallen in love with him without a chance of turning back. The young people began to date, pretending at first that they only had a business relationship, like a mechanic and his customer under the guise of repairing a car. But soon, they realized that pretending was foolish, so they started dating for real. William turned out to be a kind, deep person with a beautiful soul. He was an interesting conversationalist, knew many fascinating stories, and had a subtle sense of humor. Sometimes, Susan laughed so hard at his jokes that her cheeks and stomach hurt. Once, they went horseback riding together. William showed her the stable, taught her how to ride, and Susan liked it so much that she made her beloved promise to always bring her to the equestrian club. Every day, Susan fell more and more in love with William, discovering something new in him. Her classmates, who wore expensive brands and drove luxury cars to college, looked pale in comparison to this simple, sincere guy. Susan rejected any attempts to court her because she was faithful to William. And he genuinely didn't understand how such a beautiful, well-off girl from outside his circle could fall in love with him. Susan didn't tell Bridget about her relationship for a long time. But when she did, she regretted it deeply. Who? Asked her friend incredulously. That mechanic from the highway? You're crazy. Do you ride in his rusty car? I would be disgusted to sit there. Oh, Bridget, you're exaggerating. He's not poor. He just has a business and can't spend money on frivolities right now, Susan justified. Oh, Susan, you're so naive. Even Elton managed to get a good car, and although it's not new, I'm not ashamed to ride with him, Bridget continued. Susan sighed. She was tired of trying to convince her friend that money wasn't everything, but Bridget wouldn't back down. And are you familiar with his parents? No. His mother doesn't live here, and we still haven't had a chance to meet her. He also rarely visits her because of work. I see, Bridget said. I hope she's not an alcoholic or anything. Bridget, stop it. His mother is normal. She just had him late in life. She's an elderly woman. I see. And have you introduced him to your parents yet? Bridget continued. No, not yet. I get it. You're embarrassed, Bridget summed up. Susan got angry. No, I'm not embarrassed. I'll introduce him tomorrow. Well, we'll see, Bridget smirked. William happily agreed to meet Susan's parents. He was very nervous and afraid of making a bad impression. He picked out his shirt, thought about what to say, what flowers to give Susan's mother, and what cognac to choose for her father. However, his nervousness was in vain. Susan's parents greeted him warmly. They were extremely polite and courteous, and everything went perfectly. Susan was happy that her family liked her chosen one. As soon as the door closed behind William, Susan hugged her mother and asked, Mom, what do you think of William? The woman hugged her daughter in response and said, You know, dear, he's a good person. But he's too simple for you. And poor. You're much younger than him. Your infatuation will pass. And you'll want a serious man with status. And then what? You'll leave him. He'll suffer and probably start drinking. Think about it. Do you need this relationship? Susan protested. Mom, you too? Bridget is discouraging me, and now you too? Did you conspire or something? No, the mother calmly replied. It's just common sense. I'm not interested in your sense. Susan flared up. I love William, and we'll be together. And, besides, he's already proposed to me. The mother's eyes widened, but the father calmly asked, And what did you say, daughter? Of course, I agreed, Susan replied challengingly. Well done, darling, praised her father. William is a good guy. I approve of your choice. Susan's mother frowned and looked sternly at her husband. Richard, you're always like this. Our daughter does something not very smart, and you indulge her. But the man just smiled and kissed his wife on the top of her head. Dear, you don't know what young people are like these days. Believe me, our daughter is not studying psychology for nothing. She chose the best man. I'm 100% sure of it. However, Susan's mother was not going to give up so easily and went to William's auto repair shop the next morning. Seeing him in a greasy jumpsuit, she sighed. Yes, he was not the groom she wanted for her daughter. Mrs. Cortez, I didn't expect to see you here. Maybe some coffee? The woman smiled politely. Thank you, William. I'll pass on the coffee. I came here to talk to you. Yesterday was a lovely evening, and your bouquet was exquisite. Don't get me wrong, I have nothing against you, but I don't think you and Susan have a future." William was taken aback and couldn't find the right words, so the woman continued. "Susan is very young. She just turned 19. And how old are you?" 26. "You see, you already need a family, a wife, but it's too early for Susan for all of that. She needs a very different kind of man, you understand? Completely different. And it will be difficult for you. You're different." William tried not to lose his composure. "Thank you for your advice, Mrs. Cortez, but it's up to us to decide. I'm saving up for the wedding. If by the time I have the necessary amount Susan hasn't changed her mind, then I'll marry her. And with that, I ask for permission to leave. I have a lot to do," William said firmly. "I strongly advise you to think about my words, young man," Mrs. Cortez said wryly and headed for her car. William managed to save up for the wedding in 3 months. He worked day and night for it, but was able to buy his beloved bride an elegant diamond ring that she liked at the jeweler's. Susan understood that the ring was not within William's means, so she just tried it on and put it aside, suggesting buying a cheaper option. But the groom firmly decided that the girl of his dreams must have a sparkling diamond on her finger. Susan invited only the closest guests to the wedding, including Bridget as a witness. Bridget wore the coral dress that Susan had generously given her. She admitted that she treasured that dress and had never worn it anywhere before, but her friend's wedding was the perfect occasion. Of course, Bridget was still unhappy with the groom, but on the day of the wedding, she decided not to bring up that topic. Mrs. Cortez had also resigned herself to what was happening. She was pleasantly surprised that the guy was able to buy such an expensive ring. Deep down, she was convinced that this marriage was doomed. At the wedding, Susan met William's mother for the first time, as she had never made it to his hometown to meet her. Now, she was very ashamed of that, as Mrs. Morrison turned out to be an elderly woman with sick legs. It was wonderful how quickly both mothers found a common language. The wedding was wonderful. Everyone was in a great mood. Even Mrs. Cortez cheered up, and Susan's father periodically slapped his son-in-law on the shoulder, saying, "We'll go fishing soon. I'll cook such a fish soup, you'll lick your fingers." Suddenly, through the romantic music, Elton's joyful exclamation burst out. "Mrs. Morrison, is it really you?" All the guests fell silent and turned around, and Bridget instantly blushed and began pulling Elton's jacket. Ignoring her attempts to stop him, the guy jumped up and rushed to William's mother. "Mrs. Morrison, it's you. You haven't changed at all, even though so much time has passed." Mrs. Morrison gasped. "Elton, what a meeting. You've grown up so much, a real man now." Mrs. Cortez, sitting next to them, was surprised. "Elton, so you know each other?" "Yes, of course," exclaimed Elton. "Mrs. Morrison was a caregiver in my orphanage, the kindest one. She even adopted a boy." "Wait a minute, is this not him?" "He's the one," smiled Mrs. Morrison. Mrs. Cortez was shocked. "Wait, I don't understand anything. So William is not your son?" "He's not my biological son, but in every other way, I'm his mother. I love him with all my heart. And he loves me. We don't see each other often, but he calls me every day and pays for my treatment, even though he has a hard time with money. I adopted him when he was just a baby. The police took him from the gypsies. The child turned out to be stolen, but the parents were not found. He has a birthmark on his arm, a crescent-shaped one. I thought his parents would find him because of this mark. I went to the police, but it was a gangster time back then. No one cared. They didn't try to find his mother, and maybe she wasn't alive anymore. But the boy was too cute, so I took him." Not listening to her story, Mrs. Cortez stood up and, on trembling legs, headed towards her son-in-law. Grabbing his left hand, she pulled up the sleeve of his jacket. Seeing the birthmark, she lost consciousness. The music stopped. The guests immediately ran around, giving her water, and when she came to, she asked William to show her the birthmark again. Seeing it, she pressed her face to the guy's palm and burst into tears. "My son, my dear little son. I can't believe it! It is really you, my dear Nick." The hall fell into a heavy silence. William didn't know how to react, and Mrs. Cortez was crying, kissing his hands and asking for forgiveness. It took a long time for her to calm down and be able to tell what had happened. Many years ago, she was dating a guy and got pregnant. At first, the guy promised to marry her. But when Nick was born, he suddenly disappeared. She had to raise her little son alone. She had no relatives, and her mother had recently died, so there was no one to help. Luckily, she managed to finish medical school but couldn't do an internship because of the baby. She had to work in a warehouse because she could bring her baby in a stroller there. One day, she went to work with Nick again. But it was so hot in the room that he constantly cried, so the young mother took the baby out to the yard for fresh air so he could sleep well. No one ever went there, only the workers. Suddenly, the accountant ran in and started screaming, almost out of breath. Mrs. Cortez didn't understand at first what she wanted, but when she finally grasped the accountant's disjointed speech, horror gripped her. It turned out that she had seen, through the office window, a gypsy woman take Nick out of the stroller and run away. My colleague shouted after her, tried to catch up, but it was too late. By the time she went down the stairs, ran out into the yard, and then out of the gate, the thieves had already disappeared. They looked for Nick for a long time but never found him. Mrs. Cortez had to come to terms with a heavy loss. "Mom," Susan asked in a quiet voice when her mother finished the story, "so William is my brother? And we can't get married?" William looked at Susan, pain and confusion reflecting in his eyes. Then Susan's father joined the conversation. He tried to stay calm despite the unfolding drama. "Calm down, please. There's no sin here. Many years ago, I was married, but my wife had a weak heart. Despite the doctor's prohibitions, she decided to give birth and died in childbirth. I was grieving terribly, didn't want to take care of my daughter, blamed her for my wife's death. But then, a pediatrician from the children's hospital encouraged me so much, chose such words that my wings grew behind my back. I started to learn the role of a father and gradually grew to love my child so much that I couldn't imagine my life without her. And that woman was William's mother. We got married 2 years later, became a family. We never had any children of our own. Mrs. Cortez couldn't give birth again because of stress. I'm sorry, Susan, that we didn't tell you about your real mother. We wanted to spare you the pain. We'll show you pictures, tell you about her. But now you know that William is not your biological brother. So let's turn up the music in the hall and have some fun, because we have a wedding." A sigh of relief escaped from both William and Susan's mouths at the same time. They hugged and kissed each other. Mrs. Cortez cried on the shoulder of Mrs. Morrison and thanked her for her son. Bridget, only now realizing that she had been standing with her mouth open for about 15 minutes, came to her senses. She approached her friend and asked, "Susan, what are you going to do now? Such a wonderful story." Susan smiled back and replied, "What are we going to do? We'll just live. And we'll live happily